He says, whosoever will come after me, let him first deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. What does it really mean to take up your cross? Maybe you ought to begin by simply saying what it does not mean. Because many of us in this room today grew up in a church that taught us to take up your cross means that you have some things that you've got to deal with. I've heard people when they get sick, they say, this is my cross. I've heard people who say when they are in trouble or when things are troubling them and when they've got to deal with the difficulty of life, they'll say, well, this is a cross I have to bear. I've heard people talk about others who have messed with them or who have been against them and who have opposed them, and they've looked at it and said, this is a cross that I have to bear. But let me help you this morning. Bearing your cross is not the same thing as a sickness. A sickness or an illness is not a cross that you bear. The trouble you deal with is not a cross that you bear. The opposition that comes against you is not a cross you bear. And one of the reasons you know it's not a cross, because the reality is we want to get out from under those things. And anything you didn't pick up, something that was put on you, is not a cross, that's a thorn. And you've got to understand that what many of us are dealing with, we are dealing with a thorn in the flesh. I mean, that's what Paul talks about in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. There was given unto me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me. He says, for this thing I prayed about it 3 times and God did not move it. You must understand, God doesn't remove all of your thorn. And while God does not remove your thorn, he says, what I have is a remedy to help you deal with the thorn. He says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. That when you've got things that you've got to bear under, when you've got things that you've got to deal with, when stuff has been put on you that you had nothing at all to do with, and you've got to handle it, you've got to stay up under it, he says, I give you grace, not just cheap grace, but I give you costly grace to help you to deal with it. And I ought to be preaching to somebody this morning who ought to know something about God's grace. You've got some things you have not been able to shake, some things you have not been able to dismiss from your life. You've got some things that plague you, but the reality is, in spite of the stuff and people who have come against you, they have not been able to destroy you, because God gives you the sufficiency of grace to handle it day in and day out. You ought to thank God for his grace, and thank God that his grace is not cheap, but his grace is sufficient. Look at somebody, tell him it's all I need. His grace is all I need. If I'm sick and doctors have not been able to cure me, his grace is all I need. If my enemies have been on my trail and I have not been able to get them off of it, his grace is all that I need. If problems seem to plague my life one after another and it seems like I can't shake it, how many of you know his grace is all I need? In fact, this is my testimony. The reason I'm here today is not because the way has been smooth, not because I haven't had any mountains to climb, not because I haven't had any difficulty to deal with, but the reason I'm here today is because of his grace. Grace woke me up this morning. Grace started me on my way. Grace kept me all day yesterday. Grace kept me all night last night. It was grace that woke me. No wonder grandmama say it's amazing grace, because when I look around at all of the things grace has kept me through, it's amazing that I'm still here. Am I preaching to myself this morning? How many of you in here can thank God for his grace? Thank him for keeping you. Thank him for holding you. And thank him for sustaining you. His grace is sufficient. Yeah, he gives grace for the thorn. The thorn is what comes on you, what other people put on you, but the cross is what you pick up. The cross is what you willingly decide to take up for the cause of Christ. The cross is what you willingly endure and what you willingly go through. The cross is how you willingly allow yourself to be inconvenient so that the gospel of Jesus Christ might be furthered. The cross is when I decide, in spite of and in light of the consequences, I'm going to deal with this anyway. The cross is when I decide to deal with folk I know I don't have to deal with, but because I recognize that there is some spiritual value and redemptive value in what I'm doing, I hang in there and deal with it anyway. The cross is when I willingly allow myself to be subject to certain things and deal with certain things, because I know that in the process of going through and dealing with this, when it's all said and done, somebody's going to get to know Jesus. The cross is when I willingly decide I ain't going to shuck my responsibility. I ain't going to turn from this or turn from that, but I'm going to carry this thing. And I like what the word said. The word says this. Jesus said, whosoever will come after me, let him first deny himself. Listen, pick up his cross and follow me. In other words, what he simply says is this: when he says follow me, he means to emulate me, that you will do what I've done. And you ought to be grateful that Jesus took up the cross. I could hear him saying, no man took my life, I laid it down, and if I laid it down, I've got power to pick it up again. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he went to the Father and prayed, Father, if at all possible, bid this cup to pass from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but thine be. You got to have a nevertheless as a part of the conversation of your life, that you might be able to look at some things and but be able to say to God, nevertheless, in spite of, I am willing, God, if this is your desire for me, if this is your will, if this is your assignment for my, nevertheless what I've got to do next, nevertheless of what the consequences might be, but if this is your will, thy will be done and not mine. Jesus willingly took up the cross. You do know he could have come down, don't you? You do know that he could have summoned a legion of angels to come down from the cross, but he decided to stay right there. You do know that he was encouraged to come down from the cross, save himself and one of the thieves on the side, but he decided to stay right there. And by virtue of the fact that he was willing to bear the cross, he took up the cross. And he says, for those who will follow me, you've got to be willing to deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow me.